The Spinoff Podcast Network.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. The Investment Fix podcast. Tune in today.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Kia ora and welcome to The Fold. This week, my guest is Hamish McKenzie, who's the co-founder of Substack, which is, I'm going to call it an email newsletter platform, and Hamish is going to maybe listen back to this and wince, because he rightly says it's so much more than that, but fundamentally it is a platform whereby people can build audiences predominantly using email as the core distribution method, and then convert those into paid subscriptions. And the Spinoff's newsletters go out through Substack. Hamish is a New Zealander, and he's back in New Zealand at the moment, even though he normally lives in Northern California. And I find them a really interesting business that, as he discusses, a lot of the founding principles and the thoughts were about how social media, in terms of its engineering and its algorithms, basically is sort of unpleasant and does bad things to the world, and that email as a platform is just sort of better. And I think the thought was right, and I think that the way that they've set up the business is just super interesting and clever. And as you'll hear, 2020 was a year that Substack went from being a small bit player in the kind of media ecosystem and one of any number of email-centric startups to being one of the most talked about forces in journalism. They recruited a bunch of really big names within it: Glenn Greenwald, Matthew Yglesias, and Andrew Sullivan, to name but three. But they're actually more than just journalists, more than just kind of iconoclastic male journalists writing for Substack. There is a huge range of people, from, as he alludes to, history to professors to technology strategists. I mean, it's basically a place for writing that has value to you and for you to kind of get back to the creator. And it also gets into the teeth of some of these big knotty questions we're trying to figure out as a society right now in terms of how we deal with big technology. What is the role of moderation? Some questions of speech, which are essentially unresolved and maybe unresolvable. And Substack has, probably a relatively liberal line on speech in a way that's, and in part people are leaving bigger publications where they are feeling that the range of what can be discussed and the nature of how it can be discussed is limited there. That might become more of a problem for it in time, or that might be a force that actually just sort of propels it forward, and that's sort of part of what we talk about. There are some prominent New Zealanders on there, most notably David Farrier, Bernard Hickey, David Slack have all got good and worth reading Substacks. And just in general, I think it's a really interesting platform and a really interesting discussion, and it's definitely, at the very minimum, it's a part of what the future of media and of the funding of interesting and useful writing comes from. And they've done well enough, and this is almost, as much as it must be terrifying for them, it's also a signal achievement that both Facebook and Twitter have either launched or announced or acquired newsletter plays themselves, and that is, they are, particularly Facebook, just if they've never seen a good idea that they didn't want to copy and obliterate those who had the idea. So it'll be interesting to see whether that becomes a sort of a successful and lucrative part of their business, or just another thing that they try and do, spend a lot of money on and just fail at, because they try and steal innovation and import it, but it's not really core to who they are anymore, in my opinion. Before we get into it, I'm going to make an extra special plug for the Spinoff members because, the whole notion of Substack is that if you enjoy reading someone, that you should contribute to the creation of it, and that the more that readers contribute to the creation of something, the better that thing is. That's a fundamental assumption within Substack, and it's allowed some people to make a living. And that's also the assumption of the Spinoff members, that if you like the Spinoff, if you enjoy this podcast, and if you can spare some money, the whole function of members is that you can contribute as little as $1, and you can contribute as frequently or infrequently as you like. Every dollar is ring-fenced and goes directly into making more editorial, and we are, the Spinoff has grown. We would like to grow more. We'd like to do more. We really, really rely on our readership to fund us. It is our biggest source of revenue within the Spinoff itself. Just something to think about while you're listening to this podcast, that if you enjoy it and you can afford to contribute, we would love it if you did. If you go to thespinoff.co.nz/members, you can do that, and I would appreciate if you did. The other revenue stream for the Spinoff is working with sponsors, and this podcast is brought to you by Vodafone, and I'm tremendously grateful to them for doing that, because quite honestly, without it, I couldn't do the Fold, and I really, really enjoyed doing it. Vodafone for Business promises innovation made simple and world-class network technology. Vodafone will help maximize the potential of you and your business. Find out more at vodafone.co.nz. Thank you, and this is Hamish McKenzie from Substack on the Fold. Kia ora, Hamish. Welcome to the Fold, and really excited to have you on, because I'm rapidly becoming consumed with an obsession with newsletters, which means that I'm probably about 300 steps behind you on that scale. Let's start by just having you pitch. Imagine I'm a journalist for a moment, very difficult, but pitch me Substack.
Yeah, well, I think obviously you should have a publication on Substack. It's a place for independent writers. You can pursue the kind of work you've always dreamed of pursuing, write what you want to write, for an audience that is really interested in what you have to say. And if you want to, you can add paid subscriptions and maybe make some money from it. What
is it about email as a distribution vehicle that you like over the sort of more established models for journalism?
Yeah, we don't think of Substack as being just about email and newsletters. In fact, newsletters is kind of a shorthand. Substack is really, you get first-class treatment for the web and for the email. So you publish a post that goes out to all your devoted, signed-up readers on email, and anyone who's not already on your mailing list can find it on the web. So that part's really important as well. But the email part is really powerful because email is a platform that's not really owned or controlled by any one entity. It's a bit of an end run around social media platforms like Facebook or Twitter, where a tweak in one of their algorithms is not going to affect how your work is seen by the audience who is seeking it. And really importantly, it's an app that almost everyone has on the home screen of their phone. So you don't need to go convince someone to go download your news publications app. You're already there in the most important real estate for readers.
What led you to Substack? How early did you get in? And obviously 2020 was insane for you all, and we will get to that. But what was it that attracted you to the idea?
Well, we started Substack. It was me and a friend, Chris Best, who's the CEO, in the middle of 2017. The things that attracted us to an idea, it was a general discontent, actually, with the state of the media ecosystem, where we all live and are slave to an attention economy, where we are addicted to and increasingly angry by because of our social media feeds, where the content that is incentivized is stuff that polarizes us or divides us or makes us angry, and in some good cases, makes us happy or delighted as well. And our thought was not to hope that someone would change the algorithm and make social media better that way, or that some perfect regulation is going to come along from a government that will make social media good all of a sudden. Our thought was to create an entirely different system with a different set of rules. So we decided that to create this different system, you had to get advertising out of the picture. Direct payments was better as a way to encourage more sort of trustworthy content production. And subscriptions in particular were good for encouraging a trust-based relationship, because people pay over time and you, as the writer, have to maintain that trust of your readers. And one model we had in mind was something that Ben Thompson does with Stratechery. Ben Thompson is an American guy who lives in Taiwan, writes about and analyzes the business models of technology companies and platforms in particular. And he was writing this publication as a weekly blog post that was free and goes out to everyone on the web. And he still does this. And then 3 posts that you can get by email from him with a little bit more like ad hoc, kind of quicker and dirtier analysis along the way for the true nerds. And those people could get those emails by paying $100 a year. And that model was working really well for Ben Thompson. We knew already he was making, at that point, more than $1 million a year. I think he's making more than $3 million a year doing this. And he was telling anyone who would listen, you should try this model. It's really effective. And we just kind of thought, yeah, why don't more people try the model? That led us to Substack.
So on some level, I didn't realize the extent to which it was almost explicitly anti-social from the jump, which, at the time was a sort of an idea that was not fringe, but it was kind of, it feels like it's been mainstreamed over subsequent years. Is there some level of vindication about that? And certainly, do you feel like that is in part where the opportunity has come from? Is that more people have seen social media for what it is potentially?
I think it's one of the big winds that has been blown at our backs, and we were lucky enough to get in with that thesis just before it became really popular. In 2017, Facebook was still seen as an unstoppable behemoth, and there was discontent and grumbling about it because Trump had already come to power and some people held Facebook partially responsible. But it was the backlash against Facebook had not seriously kicked in at that point. And the general public awareness about social media engagement-based models had not fully bedded in. For instance, there's a popular documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, which is about a lot of these problems. That didn't happen until recently, like a couple of years after we started Substack. So yeah, I think it's been proven that thesis was right, and it's helped us that we were early on it.
So 2020 was crazy. Just, we transferred across to Substack as a platform maybe, was it like 18 months or so ago. And I was talking to Dan Ashinsky, who used to write newsletters for New Yorker and BuzzFeed, and writes a newsletter about newsletters, ironically, on Google Docs, which I quite enjoy. Substack was one of a group of different people that he was talking about at the time. It didn't feel like you had any more or less momentum than any one of a number of different people, though it was explicitly targeted at journalists and writers as opposed to all the other things that email can be used for, e-commerce and so on. But it feels like, now from when we first spoke to and when I was talking with Dan, which was not much more than a year ago, Substack has now made the leap from an interesting experiment to being, potentially like owning the area in a way that tends to happen with the sort of network effects of and the branding effects of technology. Why do you think 2020, which had a few other things going on, I can't recall, why do you think 2020 had that impact on user business? Or just explain what happened and the extent to which it was opportunity versus strategy, and you propelling it.
Yeah, definitely both opportunism and strategy. But I think for the first part, what helps Substack stand apart from other email newsletter providers is that Substack has actually created a category. There are people don't say check out my newsletter; they say check out my Substack, and it's partly because of that thing I mentioned before. It's not just a newsletter; it's also got a web element. It's got payments as an option involved. It's got community elements. You can have content. You can have comments and discussion threads. You can have a podcast in there if you wanted to, and it's as much a publishing platform as a kind of business model. It's like a state of thinking about how the media can be, and so. While other people allow you to send email newsletters, most of them are designed for marketing or e-commerce purposes. We're very focused on writing businesses. And so that helped us stand apart. The thing in 2020 that really changed or accelerated Substack's growth and caused a widening of the gap between Substack and the others is COVID, the pandemic. The pandemic accelerated trends that were already working in Substack's favor. One was that all of a sudden, and this might be a temporary thing, but it's certainly something that has helped us, people have had more time on their hands, more time to read, more time to start new projects, more time to write. The other major things like the economic turmoil that the pandemic's created, especially in the United States, where the pandemic is continuing without sort of an end in sight, where people are all of a sudden interested in new ways to make money online that they can do from home. And the media industry has continued to contract, and that contraction has been accelerated by COVID. And so all of a sudden, journalists who may have had stable jobs suddenly find themselves out of a job, or are more nervous than they previously were about the purported stability of the job they're in. So all those things combine to increase Substack's momentum.
The biggest names that you recruited were within the context of journalism, the likes of Glenn Greenwald, Andrew Sullivan, Matt Yglesias. They came in with huge profiles, and each one felt like a little mini earthquake because, in a couple of those cases, they were leaving publications that they founded or had a huge role in founding. Either way, they were a big part of what people thought of when they thought of those publications. Was there a level of active recruitment with them? And there's the sort of the baseline, just kind of the tide comes in and the factors that you were just referring to. But obviously, as with any kind of 80-20 rule situation, those whales, A, they help tow more in behind them, but B, there's just the greatest quantum of revenue comes from that kind of a situation. Do you want to talk a bit more specifically about the three of them?
Greenwald just showed up. We didn't recruit him. He saw some other writers he respected doing well on Substack and thought maybe that's an option for him. And then it became this moment where he was with he came to a loggerheads with The Intercept, the publication he co-founded, where he felt like his position was being censored on a story about Hunter Biden just before the election. And he thought that was untenable for him. It didn't fit with his principles. And so he saw the value in going independent, going directly to his audience through Substack. Andrew Sullivan, I had first reached out to him right when we started Substack because he was kind of a model or an example of this model working because he had previously done a subscription-supported blog in sort of 2014 and had done it for a year and just burned out because he was high-volume blogging all the time. In the meantime, since we started Substack, for reasons that are culturally related, I think, he became like, in some circles, like a forbidden writer. And we hadn't reached out to him again since and kind of didn't know if that was going to happen. But then he showed up again and got really interested, in part because he saw writers that he respected doing really well on Substack, which is how generally our momentum happens with all kinds of writers. Matt Yglesias, we did go and recruit. In some cases, we do deals with writers to help them leave whatever their secure journalism job is to help them start their own publication, the publication they've always dreamed of starting. And by giving them a bit of upfront money, we can de-risk that leap for them. And so Yglesias has been public about the amount of money that he got, and it's in the New Yorker. We paid him an upfront advance of $250,000, and the deal is he can keep 15% of the revenue that his publication generates in that first year, and then you can flip to $0 and 90% of the revenue is the normal Substack cut. And the reason we're doing that is because we think there's a bunch of writers who could do this, and they just need to be encouraged to take the leap. And that's good for the ecosystem. It's good for the Substack business.
I guess on some level, every time one of these big fish comes across, you're sort of able to triangulate their Twitter following and various other metrics to understand, well, there's a reasonably predictable, you can model this stuff, right? Yeah,
we can model it, and we're getting better at that as we do more of them.
You referred to it glancingly there with talking about Andrew Sullivan leaving for what you term cultural reasons. And like of those three writers, all of them in some ways had clashes around I don't know how you would describe it, but basically they wanted to discuss things that where the range of discussion that they felt was permissible within their publications was being somewhat limited. Does that accurately describe a large chunk of your sort of writers or readership, to put it another way? Like, is this basically white guys who are saying things that they feel like they're stifled about saying at other publications, or are there non-white guys there?
There's a couple of non-white
maybe
guys.
non-guys.
Yeah, there's a huge variety of writers who are extremely successful and saying interesting stuff across a diverse array of subjects on Substack. Those are some particularly high-profile people who happened in sequence around a clustered period of time, but they're not the only people. It's just like that's a narrative-generating subject because those three happen so closely together. I think that's one reason. Those three all felt more constrained at their publications than they would have been independent, so they saw the advantages of independence. But if you look at the top publisher on Substack, who until recently wasn't really talked about very much, and she was recently profiled in the New York Times by Ben Smith and got the attention she deserved, but was never talked about at the time when Sullivan and Greenwald and Yglesias were showing up. And she is making incredible amounts of money, has a much larger reach than any of those people, is a Boston College history professor who writes a note every day to her readers about what's gone on in the day of news. She's writing through a kind of what was an anti-Trump lens, but is like a gentle and sort of calm approach to recounting the day's events. And the same reasons that Substack are good for the likes of Andrew Sullivan apply to her as well. She can go direct to this audience who love her work and are interested in what she has to say, and they can support her so she can become not only self-sustaining, but she can become wealthy from her writing. But we also in our attempts to recruit writers try to go far and wide and get in a ton of different voices and not be pinned to any particular ideology or viewpoint.
Just getting back to the sort of model, one of my favorite Substacks is by Brian Morrissey, who's ex-Digiday, writes about the media business in a really thoughtful way. And his Substack this morning was about, in some ways, about the way that Substack's kind of reader revenue only commitments don't describe many successful media businesses. And if you think of what you're creating for writers as, ultimately little mini media businesses, in some cases much more than mini. And he said that Substack's going to have to figure out ads at some point and do more for distribution. Like basically what it is Substack just replicating the kind of, the same thing that happens on almost every platform, which is a few people at the very top do incredibly well out of them. Happens on Spotify, happens in the freaking movies. It predates technology, but it's in some ways exacerbated by it. That basically, if you come in with a high profile and a big Twitter following, you can punch out to a really good living. Yeah. If you're on those middle tiers, it's harder, and it's made harder still by the absence of the ability to kind of plug in different revenue models that might take you from starving to being able to eat.
Yeah, I think we can. I'll address the advertising piece second, but there's a ton of stuff that Substack can and will invest in to help readers find new writers to fall in love with, and writers to get discovered by readers who can fall in love with them. And there are services that we can offer too, and have started to pilot, where we kind of think of Substack as a platform for independent writers that can't just be software. Like one of the sort of problems I think with Silicon Valley is that they think of software platforms as being at stopping at just the software piece, where we think that if you're going to be an independent writer who's going to build a business on Substack, then you can improve your business and have a greater chance of success if you might have access to editing, for example, or design work or legal defense, all of which we have very early stage pilot programs going on for. Where will
they ultimately be like a service that you can plug in and in a relation for a smaller cut kind of thing?
Yeah, something like that. They won't be Substack provided, but they'll be Substack facilitated. Like, we'll help you connect to an editor, and in some cases, if it makes business sense for Substack, we may subsidize that editor. The distribution thing is a really big and interesting problem to try and tackle. And the way we would think about that is not for Substack to recreate the dynamics of an engagement-based social media feed, but to add horsepower to a recommendations network where writers and readers can recommend each other, for example. On the advertising front, we won't ever do advertising. It's not our business. It's not our interest. We're not going to support advertising technology. Some people put ads, sort of their homespun version, into their own publications. It's not necessarily because we're religiously against advertising, like we think advertising has a pernicious effect on the world or anything, but we think that subscriptions are much more interesting, and that if you have an ad in there in any way as the writer, you are subconsciously or consciously affecting the model of what you end up producing. And you can be weirder, you can be more free with format, you can say things that might not otherwise have been said if your model is subscription-based rather than advertising-based. And we want to free people up to go pursue that model and pursue that opportunity. And another part of it is that I think it's the more interesting business and technology area to explore. There's been 30 years of innovation on online advertising, and it's got us to this point where, okay, the way that plays out is that Google and Facebook become the kings of the world. But with subscriptions, with direct payments, there hasn't been as much innovation around that, and it hasn't been baked into the culture as much that you might pay an independent creator who you really love. Patreon has helped bring this on a lot. But there's so much more to do. For instance, on Substack, just a little thing is that as the publisher with paid subscriptions turned on, you can offer your own discounts. Like maybe you offer a limited time Christmas discount for your subscriptions, or you want to set up paid subscriptions just for students. And there's lots more area to explore there, and bundling might be another one in the future. For example, if several writers decide to join forces together and then split up the revenue among themselves, there's lots of cool stuff to explore there. And I think taking the eye off the ball on subscriptions to go after sort of what would be easier advertising dollars would be a mistake.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to oOh!media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
Just before we move on to talking about your cool new friends who've arrived in the newsletter business over the past few months, somewhat larger and more well capitalized potentially, I just want to talk about moderation, which is obviously, in some ways what big technology has been bedeviled by it's like attempt to engineer in moderation. Also, the way that it outsources it can feel kind of particularly ghastly. Moderation is expensive. Automating it still, even with all the greatest will in the world, doesn't seem like it does a particularly effective job of it. And all of these platforms start with, just as you alluded to Substack's vision at the start, they've got a lovely vision, and then unfortunately humans come in and make a mess of your sandpit. What is your stance on it, and how do you practice it to this point? Like where is the line for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you talk about moderation questions bedeviling platforms, we don't hear that much about WordPress having a huge problem with this. We hear a lot about how Facebook and Twitter and YouTube have huge problems with this. And I think one of the key differences there is that WordPress is not deciding what you see in your de facto newspaper. It's not pushing stuff into a feed. Active
versus passive kind of consumption.
And and also it's not like Facebook and Twitter are, because their model is based on engagement, they will amplify and reward content that's not necessarily about giving you a great reading experience or helping facilitate a common view of the truth or anything like that. It's about what provokes a strong response. And often what provokes a strong response is shitty information or bad news or stuff that is designed to enrage you.
Is there anyone you've turned away?
We did kick off a neo-Nazi early on in the days. So to explain our sort of approach, like we think Substack is closer to WordPress than it is to Facebook and Google. We're not amplifying. Like if you want to be a successful purveyor of misinformation, you should probably go to those big misinformation amplification engines that have been designed almost for that purpose.
Huge audiences there for that.
Yeah, that's how you build your movement. Yeah, so we think we're closer to like WordPress. We're like this archipelago of independent islands, and the readers have the power to opt in and out of those experiences as they see fit. They can be their own. They can be their own sort of moderators, and the writers can moderate their own communities. And we want to give them more and more tools to help them moderate their own communities. So we are massive believers in the free press. That's number one. And we don't think that the free press can be easily decoupled from free speech and freedom of expression. And so we want to have a diverse array. We want to be content neutral, viewpoint neutral, and we won't take a heavy hand in like content moderation. But we do have a content guideline that protects Substack at the extreme. So when there's people inciting violence, or porn is one thing we don't allow, for example, or hate speech, we have we do have that tool as a fallback to kind of protect the overall integrity of the ecosystem.
What did you think when big technology finally, it almost felt like it had gone from sort of 3 3/4 years of basically just, Trump can say what he wants, to suddenly he's just gone, which I find myself in this perverse position of, I thought the 3 3/4 years was really bad, really poor kind of moderation and decision making, and then I just disagreed with the decision to just blanket ban over something that basically happened off platform. What's your perspective on that? And say he turns up saying, I want to launch a Substack, what do you say?
Well, I won't address the hypothetical.
Why not?
If stuff like that comes, because you can play that game until infinity.
But it is like it's almost not a hypothetical. He approached Paula about coming on. Like, are there figures who are just too hot for Substack for reasons that might be beyond? It feels like almost like it's not completely unimaginable, and surely you have on some level contemplated it.
Yeah, when Trump arrives, if Trump ever arrives, we'll make that decision at that time, and I won't get into what internal discussions might have been about that particular person. However, I can definitely, and we definitely sort of sympathize with the Twitter position on taking him off Twitter at that time based on that series of events. But also it's just like a really difficult position that kind of can't really win there, and part of the problem for them is that they're in their business model incentivizes the stuff that leads to the sorts of behaviors that embolden and encourage Trump. Our approach is not to get into the game where the question is not what's the right degree of censorship. Our approach is to try and fix the system at a root level so that the incentives encourage different things.
Speaking of big technology, both Facebook and Twitter, as I understand it, have either announced or acquired newsletter plays, which on some level must be quite flattering. On another, Facebook don't tend to play well with others. They're also very bad at launching products, to be fair. Like, there's a reason why they acquire, and they've just got an amazing list of failed executions, as well as some that are quite successful. You had a very good tweet. Exxon announced a solar energy project when Twitter announced the acquisition of Review, which is a sort of a Substack-like service. Give me an honest when you're lying awake in bed at night, rather than a sort of here's the corporate response to knowing that these multi-billion-dollar listed, well-capitalized entities are now looking at your lawn.
Yeah, just to clarify, it was Facebook I called Exxon, I called Twitter General Motors. I think it's like a subtly important distinction.
They're both good lines.
Yeah, thanks. The honest response is it's going to be a hell of a fight, and we are not working on the assumption that Twitter and Facebook are going to mess it up. We are working on the assumption that they're going to build great products and that it's of existential concern to them. Maybe it's not. Maybe it is just a sort of random side project for them, and they don't invest that many resources in it, or they can't actually execute. But we're working on the assumption that they're serious and they're coming after this opportunity, and we can't be complacent. And that is kind of scary. They are massive, well-funded corporations that can give writers infinite distribution if they choose to, and can pay writers a hell of a lot of money to steal them from Substack if they wanted to. But it's also invigorating and exciting. It's very validating that this is a good model and that this is an opportunity worth going after in a big way. And it's very clarifying for us in helping tell the story about what Substack is all about, which is helping make a better future for writing and being very writer-focused. We're not a social media advertising company with a bolt-on who decides at some point that they want to care about writers too. So that part of it is it's both scary and exciting, and I can't really separate those two things. But that feels like good energy to have.
What have so you've got some pretty amazing investors, Y Combinator, and is it Andreessen
Horowitz?
That's insane. How and I'm assuming they'll have representatives on your board, or you'll be in contact with people there. What's their vibe? Like, are they? Yeah, so it's that weird combination of the validation of the original thought, and there are paths where you dominate, and there's paths where they just sort of slowly strangle you. What's their perspective on it? The investors.
The investors' perspective is like, let's go, the game is on, and it's a Silicon Valley mindset. It's that there's no particular loyalty to any one entity. They just want to see like the best thing win out and get big and make a lot of money. I think our investors, all of them, really believe in the mission and invested for the mission as much as the financial opportunity. So they feel like good partners to have, like good people to talk to. They're all very friendly. But the most useful part of having those investors is that they help us figure out how to build a company. It's not like, this is what your mission should be, this is how you should design your business model. It's how do you build an HR operation in your team, and when should you be thinking about hiring more execs and that kind of stuff. Which is
how big are you right now?
25 people.
It's crazy, right? Like, I remember when we were talking, you were like 6 in that sense, and now you're so much bigger, but also still tiny. Yeah. Are you short of people? Like, would you like to make the development pipe move faster?
Yes, just generally, we are racing to catch up with demand. We are under capacity, probably. We need to hire people. This year is going to be a big year for hiring.
When was the last raise you did?
June.
Are you well capitalized? Do you feel like you've got enough? Or
we've got plenty of money. There's questions about, well, would it be good to have even more money so you can go out and compete aggressively against Facebook and Twitter, for example, to like attract more writers to the platform?
Because that's the thing I wonder about, right? Like, to what extent is this? There must be some element of it's definitely in vogue right now, and in every no trend lasts forever, and there is, I certainly am more circumspect about subscribing. I probably need to unsub to a few letters because they pile up, right? Just like your New Yorkers do in the old world. I know there are only so many kind of writers who you must have your list of people. These both on a niche or a mass market level can command audience, and if Facebook were to go on an acquisition spree or Twitter, that diminishes the pool. Like, to what extent is there a sort of a danger of a peak newsletter, or of most of the audience having enough to keep them happy and not wanting to just clog the box with things that ultimately end up unread? Yeah,
this comes up a lot, and one thing is I think people underestimate how many people there are in the world. And with this model, you don't need to create the next...
a couple of million, right?
It's a couple of million, something like that.
Recently, but
yeah, it's on Wikipedia. Like, you don't need to build the next BuzzFeed that has an audience in the hundreds of millions, and it's not like there's only room for a certain number of BuzzFeeds on Substack. You are an independent writer. You can have 2,000 people who really are into what you're writing about, and they pay you, and that's enough to support your livelihood. And there's lots of groups of 2,000 people around the world. The thing about is there a finite pool of writers who can do this? I think in the current state, there's probably a finite number of writers who look like journalists, who have strong social media followings, who would be obvious targets if you were building a base for your Substack-like business to go after. And we need to go and get them. I think that kind of the way we think about that is opportunity is perishable. Like there is a moment here, and Substack's in a good position to do well in it. And so we are going to be aggressive on that. But another way of looking at it is from the reader point of view. How many readers are there in the world who are willing to pay to have a better media experience, and particularly to have their itches scratched by writers who do a great job of covering the thing that they're really interested in? And most of those publications don't exist yet. They're waiting to be invented. And so I think there's lots and lots of room for growth just on the writing part, but there's also room for growth on audio and video and live streaming, etc.
Like, a lot of this is predicated on the US is just such a monstrous market. 330 million people, a decent chunk of them very wealthy by world standards. I look at New Zealand and I wonder if, with 5 million people proportionally less wealthy than the US, I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, like, is this something that is in smaller markets not as applicable if you're not from New Zealand writing for the world, but from New Zealand writing for New Zealand, in terms of just achievable market?
Yeah, I think there's a good opportunity. I think if your audience becomes more focused and defined and you're delivering high value stuff to them, then you can charge a higher price, and therefore you don't need as many subscribers to sustain your writing business. And again, I think the numbers are small enough to make it financially viable that a market like New Zealand can support a lot of successful Substack. So,
how many are there right now where you'd look at this as something that approximates like a median wage within New Zealand, without naming names?
Oh, within New Zealand, a handful, and not.
How many are in your hand? Single digits?
Single digits, yeah. But it's not. New Zealand has not been a particular area of focus for recruiting at the moment,
for obvious reasons.
Well, it's more like we are in the US, and there is a bunch of lower hanging fruit there to go after, and sort of less convincing. I hope that New Zealand will also come along for the ride, but we haven't dedicated many resources here.
So, just to kind of swing to talking about the broader media ecosystem, what is your sort of perspective on it? Because New Zealand is so, because we've had this sort of unique or near unique experience of the pandemic, we sort of look at it, but it's abstracted to an extent. And certainly the media in New Zealand, the collapse of Bauer aside, and even there's been some kind of a rebirth and reinvigoration of a number of those titles. It doesn't feel like it really happened here. Is that because it's delayed, or because we just sort of ducked the missile? Who knows? But do you feel like when you're looking at those big media institutions on a US and world scale, what do you see happening? Because Substack can be read as a threat to the models of the big media companies. Yeah, what is the next? What's an honest assessment of what the next few years look like to you?
I think the giants will continue to be giants and may even grow into larger giants. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and the likes, Washington Post. And then the people who are doing niche publications, and particularly on Substack, are also going to really thrive, and that's going to grow as an ecosystem. And any existing media institutions in the middle is going to be a really tough time for. It's already a tough time for. The US newspapers are shutting down left, right, and center, especially in communities. So I don't think Substack is necessarily competition to traditional media. I think it's actually an opportunity. I think we have not sought to work with traditional outlets so much because there's unlearning that has to happen, and there's adapting to the Substack way of life that would have to happen. And too often they would be trying to make the adaptation happen in the other direction, make Substack work for us. And that might be an interesting business for someone else to go after. What we're more interested in is the next generation. And so for next generation outlets who are organized as a newsroom, I think Substack can still make sense. For example, The Dispatch is a center-right politics publication with a newsroom structure and has editors and fact-checkers and some business people. Just a much lighter weight kind of organization built natively on Substack with the Substack model in mind. And that is doing outstandingly well. And The Bulwark is another one. It fits a similar profile. It's also like anti-Trump, right-wing politics. And it just so happened that those two sort of watched each other. And they're using Substack to do a premium bundle of newsletters and podcasts on the side of their other operation, which is an ad-free website also. And that's working really well for them. And I think traditional media organizations, I don't think it's going to be like, we can do a Substack now and that's going to save them or like reinvent their prospects. But they could invest and be important participants in fostering the next generation publications and the next generation of writers who are going to succeed in a media ecosystem that looks different in the future, because they're already well placed to do that with their editorial resources, their ability to tell good stories, their existing distribution channels, and money. They can fund some writers to get started and see where it goes.
We're almost out of time, but it would be remiss of me not to get a little bit of Musk chat in. You worked at Tesla during the relatively early days, and he was nominally your boss, is that correct?
Yeah, nominally. Very nominally. He hired me to go work at Tesla to be the lead writer, and it was January 2014 when I started, which is, he was already very big and famous in Silicon Valley and starting to get very big and famous around the world, but in a cult level, and it's not at the level he is now. What
were your sort of lingering memories of that period? How long were you with Tesla? And
I lasted like just over a year, which is actually pretty long in Tesla time, but I was tossing up by the end of that time whether I should stay or not, and felt like I was more excited to go back to the life of an independent writer. So I went and wrote a book about Tesla after that.
Yeah, do you remember it fondly? And what are your sort of what are your main kind of memories of that period? Because he's now the richest man in the world most days, and certainly one of the most famous, and feels like, for better and worse, where humanity is almost like he is steering humanity more than almost anyone else on this planet. If that thesis is true, do you think he's an appropriate person to be doing that? Like based on your interactions?
No one is the appropriate person to
clearly.
do that.
But if you sort of have to live with it. Like, do you think that no one man should have all that power? But if it's going to happen, what do you think that his intentions are good? Like, he's such a complex and divisive figure, which should start a Substack.
He should. So the first question is like, what are my memories like? My memories are really happy from that time. If I had held on for longer than I did, I think maybe my memories would be less happy. It's a really difficult place to work, but it's full of exhilaration and excitement, and I got to go inside this incredible company, and it's an incredible time in history, like in the same room as this incredible figure in history, and I would never trade that. That was an amazing experience, and I'm also glad that I left when I did. Is he the right person to be God for the multiverse? I would not want him to be my dad. I would not want him to be my friend. But I think in terms of the way the economy is structured and the way power structures work right now, I think a battering ram like him has been useful for society in helping make things that needed to happen, like electric cars, like getting off fossil fuels. He has to get a huge amount of credit for getting the world off fossil fuels. And personality things aside, I'm glad he did it, and I'm glad he took the initiative, and I'm not sure that anyone else would have done it in that time as quickly. In terms of exploring space and landing rockets back on their launch pads to make them reusable, that is like a massively underrated achievement that could change the course of human populations through millions of years in the future. And maybe it doesn't, but it's increased the chance from almost zero to some percentage. And I think that's like at least really interesting, and it could be really important depending on your opinions of about whether or not humanity should just die on planet Earth. And I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure where I sit on that.
Great buzzy note to end on. Thank you so much for coming on the Fold, Hamish, and good luck. It feels like you've strapped yourself to your own rocket ship now, and it's going to be wild. And I will be watching. That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spinoff Podcast Network.